There's this concept of productivity which gets talked about all the time on YouTube, which is this idea of how productive are you? How well are you using your time to be as efficient as possible? Some of that is about how much of your time you're able to focus for. Some of that is about how do you rid yourself of distractions so that a larger percentage of your day is spent doing work that is productive in terms of your job, or often there's an idea in here that you are working for yourself, for your own business or something. At other times, it might not just be about are you spending time doing work, tapping at your keyboard, but it might be about how are you using that time and kind of streamlining your process so that the time you're spending isn't just making sure that you're doing that rather than watching TikToks, that you've got systems in place to make sure that the time that you're spending is spent even better. And it's all this very kind of individualistic view of how productivity works, that if you are not being productive, that it is very much that either you are being distracted too much, you don't have the grit and determination to stay on a particular topic for long enough, or that you don't have the systems in place. You've not been clever enough to make sure that, you've got, is it called a macro where you hit one button and it does a bunch of stuff on your computer? That you've not been clever enough to implement that. There's a certain kind of genre of productivity YouTuber who every year will make a video about the best note-taking apps. And inevitably what happens is that they have a favorite note-taking app at one point, and then 6 months later, they've got another note-taking app, which is now their best favorite note-taking app. And then 6 months after that, there's another one yet again that is now their favorite note-taking app. I don't know to what extent, I haven't watched enough of these videos to know whether or not there is some kind of slightly murky sponsorship of productivity YouTubers to say that a particular app is the best. But I think regardless of that, the economics of YouTube in terms of needing to keep making videos means that they have to constantly have a new favorite app because that's their content, right? That's the thing that their stuff is about. One thing that these kind of productivity YouTubers sort of rely on in terms of keeping you watching their videos is this idea that at some point this perfect app is going to come around the corner and change your world. And they are constantly telling people that this has happened, that this is the new app that is going to change your world and make you so much more productive. But then 6 months later, they have a different one that is now the app that's going to change your world. Realistically, if productivity YouTubers were doing their job really well, you would watch one of their videos and then watch none of them ever again, because they'd already told you the best note-taking and writing apps. But all of this plays into the idea of productivity being this very individualist, personal thing that if you are not productive, it is your fault. But when we talk about productivity on a sort of broader economic level, a lot of that stuff isn't governed by whether British workers work hard. So Britannia Unchained was a book published by a bunch of Conservative MPs in 2012, including Liz Truss, who at one point was Prime Minister, very briefly, of the UK, Dominic Raab, Priti Patel, Chris Skidmore, who I think has sort of fallen off the face of the earth now. I've not heard about him for a while at least, and Kwasi Kwarteng, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer under Liz Truss. The book suggested that British workers were among the worst idlers in the world. So it blamed the UK's poor productivity on the attitudes of workers, that people just weren't turning up, they were sort of slacking away at work, weren't really putting their all into it. But in reality, so much of productivity in this sense, and I think we can totally apply this to this kind of personal productivity as well as to productivity in terms of an economy as a whole. So much of productivity is not about mindset, it's not about how hardworking are you, it's about all this contextual stuff, which at the end of the day is going to be far more influential in how productive you are than whether you've got hustle, right? Whether you've got grit. So much of productivity, what we think of as productivity, is actually influenced not by your grit and determination, not by how much you kind of show up at work, or whether you're quiet quitting or not. So much of it is contextual. if it takes you 2 hours each day to drive to and from work, an hour commute each way is not unusual, then you're going to be more tired at work than you would be if you had a really efficient transport network where you live. If you have good mental health services near you, then it might be that if you do get a bit down for whatever reason, you have a bad period of mental health, then there is a service available to you which is able to help you to feel better, right? And to therefore, if that's not the case, you're likely just to be depressed, right? And that is going to affect your work. If you're able to access good mental health care, then you will be able to hopefully address some of those issues closer to the time and therefore be able to be more productive at work. There are technical things as well. In terms of having reliable and high-speed internet is increasingly important to people across industries. I feel this particularly in my job. So this view of productivity as being this really personal thing, you can make little tweaks to your workflow to make yourself a bit more productive and to use your time better and to develop systems that are going to make sure you're not wasting time on busy work. Particularly once you're working with a team, there's even more things of trying to make sure that people are working together well. It's not the case that none of this stuff is useful or important in any way. There are lots of ways in which you can tweak your workflow to make yourself a little bit more productive. However, the much more substantial things are those much, much larger questions. We've got transport, we've got internet speeds, we've got all of this other stuff, which is just going to have so much more of an impact on productivity than these tiny little tweaks. My kind of takeaway is that if you really want to see productivity increase, then you should be less worried about finding the right note-taking app and more worried about encouraging investment into infrastructure, public transport, roads, internet, healthcare, all of that stuff, which is much more influential in terms of making people more productive than whether they use Evernote or Apple Notes.